Hello, and welcome to the Patent Literacy Symposium and this session, Instructionally Relevant Diagnostic Assessment of Comprehension. My name is Maggie Serpolowski, and I am joined by my colleague, Karen Brady. We are so excited to facilitate this session for everyone. Before we start, we have a few housekeeping items to review. You can access the presenter handouts for this session, the presenter bio, and the conference schedule on the patent website, and the link is provided in the chat. Just a reminder, this session will be recorded and is 75 minutes in length, which will include a 15-minute Q&A period at the end. We will compile those questions in the chat and save those questions for that end time of 15 minutes. To access closed captioning, click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience technology difficulties, please go to the technical support guides area above the schedule on the symposium page. Please keep your video feature off and stay muted to eliminate any potential distractions during the presentation portion of our session. We would love for you to tweet out or share out on social media all of your learning from the Literacy Symposium. The hashtag for the symposium is hashtag PatentLit2022. And now it is our pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Stoller.
Thanks so much, Maggie, and thank you, Karen, also, and everybody at Patent who has been working for many months behind the scenes to make this symposium possible. Thank you for including me in this fantastic learning opportunity. It's really my honor to be here with all of you, and I hope that you will participate by sending questions into the chat. We will have some time at the end to address any questions that you have as we go along. So what I want to be talking about today is the opportunity to assess reading comprehension and listening comprehension in a way that might be a little bit different from what you're used to doing, and give you some ways to think about the skills of listening and reading comprehension and how they might be measured. So let's take a look at the objectives for the session. We're going to begin by talking about what reading comprehension is and why it's so challenging to measure. We're going to put our assessment into the framework of collaborative problem solving. So I'll give a brief description of that model, and then we'll be linking our conversation about assessing comprehension to the steps of that model. I'm going to be using as an illustration or example the Acadience reading for the Acadience reading diagnostic for comprehension, fluency, and oral language, CFOL. We affectionately call it CFOL, so you'll hear me referring to it that way. And in full disclosure, I used to work for the authors of Acadience reading, which is formerly known as Dibbles Next. I was part of a group that conducted research to create this assessment. And so it's something that I know a little bit about. I've given it to a whole bunch of students, and just wanted you to know that I have that background, and it's the reason why I can use it as an illustration of a way to do instructionally relevant assessment of reading comprehension. And then we will talk a little bit about how we might be linking the assessment information to instruction or intervention. So I'll just do some brief case examples. Okay, so let's start with just thinking about what reading comprehension is. And I want to try to stretch your thinking beyond the way that you might typically think about reading comprehension. In many cases, what I experience in schools is conversations about reading comprehension that are focused on the products, the ways that we ask students to display that they understand what they've read. And that's, I think, a very narrow and sort of limiting way to think about the strategies or the products that are outcomes of understanding what you're reading, like being able to summarize or make a prediction or get the main idea of what you're reading. Those are products, not necessarily the process of understanding what you're reading. So because reading comprehension is so complex, this is perhaps one of the most complex human behaviors, it can be difficult for us to get our arms around. And in fact, there are many different ways of conceptualizing reading comprehension. If you look into the reading research, you'll see a variety of different models that represent different ways of conceptualizing and thinking about what reading comprehension even is. And so the understanding is that we have this complexity within this construct of reading comprehension, and it is made up of these different linguistic and cognitive processes. And boy, those are tough to really observe, they're tough to define, and they're certainly difficult to measure. So this adds to the difficulty with doing assessment of reading comprehension. I'm going to share with you a definition from Kate Nation. Her definition of reading comprehension gets at the fact that because we as adult readers and skilled readers find it effortless to sort of get the author's meaning and to glean information from what we read, it makes it even more challenging for us to think about unpacking what might be going on when a student is a struggling reader. So it kind of masks the complexity of what's happening here, because to us, it seems like it's effortless. But you can see in this definition that she's also identifying these cognitive and linguistic operations that are happening as we read. And that can range from simple as if it's simple, word recognition. It's a little bit more straightforward, I should say, word recognition, to more complex kinds of outcomes, like being able to draw inferences from what you're reading, where there are gaps in what you're reading. So the range of ways to think about reading comprehension, I think, are really captured in this statement. So this idea of reading comprehension being so complex means that it's very difficult for us to measure. That is one of the challenges. So unlike word recognition, which we can actually see and hear if it's happening, this idea of reading comprehension being sort of underground, it's not directly observable. We have to infer that a student has understood what they're reading by other behaviors that we can observe. Within the realm of assessing reading comprehension, we don't have fantastic tools for doing this. We especially don't have great tools for classroom teachers to use. The reading comprehension assessments that researchers often use aren't typically correlated well with each other. So depending on which reading comprehension assessment that you use, you might get a different picture of comprehension because they're coming at it in a different way. And you could get a different result on the students depending on which comprehension assessment that you use. So it's challenging to have consistency in the identification of students who need support around comprehension. And some of the reading comprehension tools that are out there that researchers use are more clinical in nature. They are more about making a diagnosis, let's say, of a reading disability. They don't have as much relevance to what we are doing in classrooms and in schools. Or on the other end of the spectrum, the kinds of comprehension assessments that teachers tend to use in classrooms tend to be quite informal. They are either created by the teacher, or they come with a reading program or a reading series or an intervention program, and they're just informal in nature. So that might make it more difficult to get a solid picture of a student's comprehension skills. So lots of challenges around the difficulty of measuring these really, really important skills. So going to the theoretical model, the simple view of reading, helps us sort of ground the way of thinking about reading comprehension as the product of these two broad capacities, word recognition and language comprehension. And if students are lacking capabilities in either word recognition or language comprehension, their reading comprehension skills will be compromised. And you can't overcome having difficulties in word recognition or language comprehension by compensating on on the other one. It doesn't work that way. You have to have competencies in both of these domains. And so this simple view of reading is really helpful for giving educators a way of thinking about creating reading comprehension, right? So it gives us the domains of skills that students have to acquire as a result of our instruction. We have to support students to learn both skills in the area of word recognition and language comprehension. And then it also gives us sort of a framework for thinking about when things go wrong. If students are not understanding what they're reading, we can track backwards, so to speak, into language comprehension and word recognition to unpack why is the student not understanding what they're reading. So obviously these are broad categories of skills, but what the simple view does is tells us that for a student to understand what they're reading, they have to have competencies in these two areas. So I think it's a helpful framework when we're talking about assessment, especially thinking about students who might be struggling with reading comprehension. A couple of quotes and ideas from Charles Perfetti that I think are really helpful for getting us primed for thinking about measuring and assessing reading comprehension. We need to keep in mind that all of the language structures are important for reading comprehension, just like that simple view gives it to us in that graphic, that math problem. We have to think about all of the components of language: phonology, morphology, orthography, semantics, syntax. Those are all structures of language that contribute to reading comprehension. And all of those components, those underlying processes, those cognitive and linguistic processes are things that we can focus on in instruction. So if we want reading comprehension as the result, those language structures really need to be at the forefront of what we're teaching, what we're working on, what we're preparing students with in our instruction. And I always want to remind folks when we're thinking about reading comprehension that reading itself is a language-based skill. So it's not possible to understand in print what you wouldn't understand in spoken language. And I think especially those of you who work with younger students, pre-K through, let's say, third grade, it can be tempting to just focus on the word recognition skills. Those are so essential and important. We absolutely must prioritize them during instruction and equip students with excellent word recognition skills. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we are keeping that language comprehension strand growing and developing, and also an area of focus for instruction. So at some point, those skills will come together for students, and they will be able to understand what they're reading in the same way that they understand if it was said to them in spoken language. So just some things to keep in mind as we move into assessment. So here's the practical problem of all of this complexity, right? Is that the ways that we have typically thought about or even measured reading comprehension as strategies is probably too limiting. It's probably not really going to serve us well, because just teaching those strategies, and what do I mean by strategies? Being able to summarize, being able to predict, being able to identify the main idea and details in what was read. Those strategies, if students have difficulty producing those kinds of strategies, it doesn't really help us with what to do about it. Simply teaching students to do those kinds of things doesn't really result in better reading comprehension. It's limited, I guess I would say. And so there's more to it. And this obviously presents a problem in instruction. So saying a student has a reading comprehension problem is just too vague. It's too general. We have to get to the level of specificity and even beyond what the simple view would say. So what specifically in the area of word recognition, or what specific language comprehension skills is the student needing support on. We have to get to that level. And so it's important for educators to understand what those elements of reading comprehension are, and then also how to measure them, and certainly how to intervene or instruct in a way that students will be more likely to acquire reading comprehension. So I like to think about really any problems that are facing students within the problem-solving model. So the collaborative problem-solving process is a database decision-making model. It is a way of asking questions about students and using assessment data to answer the questions. It's a framework. It gives you a thinking process. So when you're faced with a student who's a struggling reader, it gives you a series of steps to go through. So 4 steps in the version of the problem-solving process that I tend to use. The first one is to identify the problem. So identifying which students are at risk, identifying specifically what they are at risk on. And we would typically do that by stating the difference between what we expect the student to do and what they're actually doing. The second step is to analyze the problem. And here's where we're asking, why is that problem happening? We're collecting additional data to answer our problem analysis questions. We're fleshing out the various reasons why a student might have the stated problem. And we want, as a result of this second step, to develop an educated guess or hypothesis about the primary reason why this problem is happening, because that's going to lead us to the third step, which is to plan and implement some kind of change to instruction that's addressed directly at the hypothesis that we developed in step 2. And then we're going to evaluate if our instruction is working, and that might cause us to cycle back to step 1, or maybe to change our plan in some way, or even to do some additional assessment at step 2. So this kind of thinking process can be used by teams at all levels of your system, your district leadership team, your building literacy team, grade level teams, even when we're talking about individual students. And it's linked to the purposes of assessment that you would see in a school-wide literacy model like MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. So this is a process that once you learn how to think in this way, it has lots of application for you throughout all of the work that you're doing to improve students' literacy outcomes. So I want to link the purposes of assessment to these steps of the problem-solving process. So as I said, that first step, the problem identification step, is asking who's at risk, what is the problem, right? So that's a screening question. The second kind of assessment that we use in a problem-solving model would be diagnostic assessment, helping us to tease out why is the problem happening. And then progress monitoring assessment helps us to evaluate the effectiveness of our instruction. So just to draw a connection there between the purposes of assessment and the steps of this model. Where I'm going to focus today is on the diagnostic assessment. So the kinds of assessments that help us to answer the why questions, help us to flesh out why a student, in our case today, might have difficulty with reading comprehension. So just to kind of summarize and highlight these 2 purposes, screening assessment, that's the brief, standardized set of indicators that are predictive of good reading in the future, and they answer questions about who might be at risk. The diagnostic assessment is a different purpose, so a different set of tools would be used for diagnostic assessment. Good screening tools make bad diagnostic assessments. So these are 2 categories with 2 different purposes. Diagnostic assessment is typically in depth. It is more flexible. It's typically not timed. We're not so worried about the score like we are on screening. We're more interested in linking the underlying causes of the problem with instruction. So giving us information that we can directly act on in our instruction. So I want to just briefly talk through a couple of case examples to sort of set the stage for the kind of scenario that I'm specifically thinking about. So I'm going to be using as an example the kinds of direct measures that are called curriculum-based measures. And you'll see some of them listed here, specifically the maze and the oral reading fluency or ORF assessment. You'll find these screening indicators in assessments like AIMSweb, Dibble's 8th edition, FastBridge, or Acadience Reading. They are tools that have a long history as being excellent screening and progress monitoring assessments, and they're really helpful for implementing that MTSS model, that school-wide literacy model. So a maze assessment would be something where you're giving students a passage of text. There are words deleted, there are options printed there, and the student has to circle the word that fits best in the story. And those are excellent group administered indicators of reading comprehension, silent reading comprehension specifically. And then oral reading fluency is giving students a passage of grade level text that they haven't seen before, asking them to read for a minute and identifying the number of words they read correctly, getting an accuracy percent, in some cases asking students to talk about what they've read. So a 1-minute activity that's done one-on-one, students are reading orally on oral reading fluency. Again, a long history of that being a reliable and valid indicator of reading comprehension and predictor of future reading comprehension. So these are common tools that you may or may not be familiar with. They are excellent in that category of screening and can also be used for progress monitoring. So let's talk about student A in my example here, whose maze and oral reading fluency retell scores are low, indicating difficulty with reading comprehension. Here's a student whose words correct score on oral reading fluency is low, and their accuracy score is low on oral reading fluency. So this is a student who has a reading comprehension problem, and at the heart of it is something related to word recognition, right? That's what that specific accuracy score is indicating and telling us. So this is a student who we might have a problem definition statement about the inaccurate reading, right? And we have questions about why is the student not reading the words correctly? Which patterns do they know how to read and not know how to read? Which kinds of words do they make errors on? And a diagnostic assessment to answer those questions would be a diagnostic decoding assessment, right? So that might be something like the Acadience Reading Diagnostic for word reading and decoding. It might be something like the decoding survey from Really Great Reading, or the PSI from 95% group, right? Those are examples of diagnostic assessments of word recognition. And in a scenario where your screening data looks like student A's data, you want to focus in on that word recognition component, and a diagnostic of decoding skills would be appropriate. But take a look at student B, a little bit different pattern of scores on screening. Oral reading fluency accuracy seems to be just fine. So not a problem with word recognition, but this student's comprehension is limited by their fluency, right? So here's where we would want to perhaps do a diagnostic in the area of fluency, and I'll describe that a little bit for you, but definitely be working on building fluency and automaticity in text. Accuracy is already in place, so we can shift to building fluency. That's going to support the student's comprehension. And then take a look at student C, yet again, a different pattern of scores. This student is accurate and fluent in grade level text, but still not able to talk about what they've read or do that silent reading indicator on the maze. So this is a less frequent pattern, I would say, a less typical pattern. Typically, students who are accurate and fluent are also understanding what they're reading. That's why ORF works so well as a screener. But in this student's case, we're sort of left with this puzzle, right? Like they're accurate and fluent and they should understand what they're reading, but they're not. So now what are we going to do? This is where we really need that diagnostic assessment of reading comprehension, of language comprehension. And so that's where we want to focus in. Here's a little summary of student C. This student is accurate and fluent, but surprisingly not understanding what she's reading. And so that would give us that problem definition statement. But at step 2, we're going to generate assessment questions. So I have a list of them here. Questions about why that comprehension problem might be occurring. And this is going to guide our selection of diagnostic assessments. We want to choose diagnostic tools that will answer the specific assessment questions that we have at the second step of the problem-solving process. So as I mentioned, I'm going to share with you an example of a tool that would fit for this kind of assessment, diagnostic assessment, like student C, if you have a scenario like this. And it's called the Acadience Reading Diagnostic of Comprehension, Fluency, and Oral Language, or CFOL, CFOL. It is linked to the Acadience Reading Screening Assessment for K6, but you can use any screening assessment and still use CFOL as your diagnostic. One of the unique features is it is designed for classroom teachers to use. So it's not meant to be used in a clinical way. You don't have to be a specialist to use this assessment. Although reading specialists, school psychologists, speech pathologists also can use this tool. Great care was taken to make sure that it is brief, yet thoroughly measuring the domains that I'm going to share with you. It is untimed, and you are not worried about the score. So this is different from screening, right? So on a screening assessment, we're very concerned about the student's score and how it compares to, let's say, a standard like a benchmark goal. That's not the case with diagnostic assessment. We're more concerned with sort of how and why the student is having difficulty in an area and being linked to instruction. So on CFOL, there are 7 domains of skills that are measured by 20 different tasks. You are not giving all of those to any student. So you're making choices based on your assessment questions, which of those tasks you're going to give to any one student. Within each of those tasks, the items get more difficult, and that's helpful for keeping this assessment as brief as possible. You're giving it one-on-one to students. It is currently done paper pencil. And although there are standardized directions, there's very flexible scoring. Lots of different ways of prompting and even teaching during the assessment. Whoa, right? Like that's completely different from the way we would do screening. Even the Acadience Reading Screening, K6, it's standardized. There are only scripted things that you can say, right? Scripted prompts and so forth. That's very different from the diagnostic assessment. Here, you can actually change the directions. You can state them in a different way. You can use language from your classroom, materials from your classroom. You can use lots of levels of prompting. So you can support the student. Actually, that's one of the things you're trying to find out on a diagnostic assessment is how much support is required for the student to give you a correct answer so that you can translate that into the instruction for the student. There are discontinue rules. So because the tasks are sequenced from easier to harder, once they start getting items wrong, you stop the assessment, discontinue. So you're not wasting time on things that you know are going to be too difficult for the student. There is a checklist that helps you to know which of the domains you should be assessing based on the assessment questions you have about the student. There was research to construct this tool so that you can be sure that it is reliable and valid. And part of that research involved collecting feedback from teachers who used it about it being easy to use. So here are the 7 domains that are measured on the CFOL assessment. And I'm just briefly going to give you sort of a sense of what's being measured on the tasks within each of these domains. But so if you think back to that student C example that I was giving you, a student who's accurate and fluent, but not able to do that basic level of comprehension, even just retelling what they read. So digging deeper with some assessment questions at step 2 of the problem solving process, why is the student struggling to understand what they're reading? So if you think about those questions, that's what's really going to focus you in on which of these domains you would assess if you're using the CFAL assessment. So the story coherence domain, it has 2 tasks within it. The first one is called storytelling. And on this one, you are showing the student a picture, series of pictures, and asking them to tell a story about the picture. That one is measured on a rubric. So you are asking students to give a story that would sort of describe the picture. And that rubric is a 5-point rubric that is measuring things related to the sequence of the story that the student is telling about the picture, if it includes cause and effect, for example, if it stays on topic, if there's like a closing kind of statement. Those are some of the elements that you're scoring on for the storytelling task. There's also what happens next. Again, a series of pictures, and the student is asked to say what might happen next in that sequence. On this one, it's also scored on a rubric, and it's a 2-point rubric, I believe. And the highest score is given for students who are making an inference in their prediction, their what happens next statement. The second domain is listening comprehension. And this is important because I think a lot of times teachers will come up with listening comprehension as a possible barrier for students, but they don't have a good formal way to unpack that. Informally, you can just read something to a student, ask them questions about it, but that doesn't really let you sort of dig into the processes that might need some support for a student. So within the area of listening comprehension, there is a retell task. And this one has the assessor reading to the student. And there are 2 different types of passages. So you might read narrative passages and you would read expository passages, and they're scored on a 5-point rubric, but with different criteria. So the narrative passage is going to be scored on a retell that includes things like the topic and some details, talks about the character or the setting. And the expository retell is scored on a rubric that includes things like being able to capture the topic and details, having facts in the retell that were from what they listened to. The second component within listening comprehension is a question and answer task. And again, the assessor is reading a paragraph to the student, and then there are passage-specific questions that are asked. And they get more difficult as you go through the items. Some of them are just basic factual pieces, who, what, when, where, why kinds of questions about what they heard. And then others are more difficult, asking them to draw inferences, for example. The third domain is reading comprehension. And within the reading comprehension domain, there are 4 tasks. The first one is a paragraph retell. So the one that I just described was listening retell. Now this is reading retell. And from not just a 1-minute sample like you would get on screening, but this is from the student reading an entire paragraph. There are narrative and expository passages that the student reads with that same 5-point scoring rubric for each of those types of passages. The second task within reading comprehension is homophones task. And on this one, the student is looking at a sentence with a blank, and above the sentence are 2 words. And they have to point to the word that is the correct word for the blank in that sentence. So the words might be S-U-N and S-O-N, and they have to point to the choice that would fit and make sense in that sentence. So they have to do the reading and they have to make that selection. In a similar way, There's a task that has to do with homographs. So on this one, the student is asked to correctly read a sentence that includes homographs. So trying to think of an example, live and live would be an example. So I'm not going to be able to come up with a sentence off the top of my head, but you get the idea. They have to pronounce the word correctly for the context of the sentence as they are reading it, right? So a way of demonstrating their comprehension. And then the last component in reading comprehension is just like paragraph retell. So it's scored in the same way. There are narrative and expository passages, but instead of it being a paragraph that the student reads, they read an entire passage on that one. So it really helps you tease out, is it a stamina kind of issue? Can they perform correctly if it's a short paragraph, but they're having more difficulty in a long passage? So those two different tasks are helpful for sorting that out. The fourth domain is measuring syntax and grammar. Again, something that we in classrooms typically don't have really good tools and resources for measuring in a more formal way. There are 5 tasks within this domain. The first one is matching sentences to pictures. So this is a way of measuring students' understanding of words that are different parts of speech, words as they are used in a certain sequence in sentences. For example, I'm thinking of one of the items has pictures, 4 different pictures. There are cats or a cat in each of the pictures. And you read the sentence, there are many cats, and the student needs to point to the picture that represents what you said, right? So they have to understand it and then point in a way that shows their understanding. There is a task that's related to students' knowledge of plurals. And on this one, you are giving the student a target word and then reading a sentence that has a blank, and they have to fill in the blank. And so they have to demonstrate that they know how to pluralize the target word. So it starts out with simple words. So they might need to use the word girl, and in the sentence, they have to turn it into girls. And then it gets more complex from there. Like it might be the word man, and they have to use the word men in the story. Or, I'm sorry, in the sentence. There's a task similar to that that has to do with the student being able to understand past tense. So you would say a word, a target word, and read a story with a blank. The student has to use the correct form of that target word in the blank. So maybe the target word is run, and the student needs to use the form ran in the blank in the sentence. There is also a sentence anagrams task where you are giving the words to the student in a mixed up order, and they have to reorder those words into a sentence that makes sense. So really getting at syntax and word order. And then finally, there is a sentence repetition task where you are speaking, the assessor is speaking the sentence, and the student has to repeat it verbatim. And those get more complex as you go along to the point where it is quite complex to hold those in short-term memory and be able to repeat them. In the morphological awareness domain, there are a variety of tasks that I find to be extremely interesting to give to students. This is where you really start to turn up those underlying language components that students might be missing, again, in their oral language. So translating it into print is not going to happen because they don't really own this skill in their oral language. The first task is about morpheme compounding. So this has students creating compound words. You give an example to them, and then you give them a word that they have to create the compound with it. So they have to come up with that from your example. The second task is sentence completion. And on this one, you are giving the student a target word, and they have to use the correct form of the word in a blank in a sentence. So they have to, let's say, use the ing version, or maybe you give them the ed version and they have to use just the base word. So that kind of a task where they are needing to decompose words, use derivations or inflections of words. There is a task that's really fun to do with students called making words, where you give a target word and they have to generate as many words as they can think of with that word. So more credit is given for giving derivations. They get sort of like partial credit for inflections. So if you would use the target word play, for example, the student might come up with plays, playing, played, but also they might come up with replay, playground, player, right? So as many words as they can generate with that target word. Whoops. The vocabulary and word knowledge domain has a variety of tasks that get at the breadth and depth of word knowledge. There is a formal definitions task. And so on this one, you're looking for the student to give orally a formal definition. So something like a kitchen is a room in your house where you make food, right? So putting it into that category, giving a formal sort of academic definition of the word. There's also a multiple meanings task, which gets more at the breadth of word knowledge. The assessor says a word and the student has to give two meanings of the word. So an example would be a word like rose, and you'd be looking for the student to say a rose is a flower and rose means you stood up, right? So giving two meanings of a word. There's also a figurative language task. This can be very helpful, particularly with English learners, where this can really be a challenge and a struggle. You are reading a paragraph to the student that contains an idiom, and at the end of them listening to that paragraph, you ask them what the idiom means. So you might have an idiom like on the ball in the paragraph, and the student has to say what it means. And then the last domain is reading fluency. And this is assessed with an expository and a narrative passage that the student is reading out loud. It's untimed. And you are scoring with a rubric. And that rubric has 7 elements to it. So 7 different components that you're listening for, watching for as the student is reading, and then you're scoring it on a rubric. So you're listening for things like prosody. Is the student reading with expression? Are they reading with phrasing? Are they attending to punctuation? Are they accurate? Do they seem to be getting the gist? Can you kind of glean that from the fluidity and phrasing and expression in their reading? So a little bit different way of measuring fluency, certainly, than what you're doing on screening with something like oral reading fluency. So all of the information from any of those domains or tasks that you might have assessed with an individual student. And again, you would never give all of those to any one student, right? You're only making selections based on your problem analysis questions at step 2 of the problem solving process. You're picking and choosing among those that will give you information about the questions, to answer the questions you have about that individual student. And then there's a score summary page that allows you to identify the number that the student got right without any prompting, the number they got right with prompting, and certainly you're making notes as you're going along about what the prompts were, what level of prompting was necessary. Did you have to break the task down? Did you have to repeat the directions? Did you have to show them an example and then have them repeat it? You know, how much support was needed to get a correct response? And it's not about the score. You're kind of capturing that on this summary page, you know, the number they got right with prompting and without prompting, but there's no benchmark or standard that you're comparing a score to. That's really not what it's about. You're just trying to capture and draw as sort of conclusions, what areas did they seem to be perfectly accurate on? And so we would consider those skills to be mastered. versus areas where their skills might be emerging. They got some right, but not all of them right, versus the ones where they really got no correct responses or very few. That's what's going to bubble up as the areas in which they need instructional support. So if a student has difficulty with a task, you want to ask yourself some questions. You want to think about, is this a skill that they're having difficulty with because they haven't had any instruction in it yet? So like if your school, perhaps in prior grade levels, has not done any direct instruction in morphology or syntax or language structures in general, then that's a different scenario when a student struggles in those areas versus if they have had direct instruction in a skill and they're still struggling with it, right? You want to think about the cultural and linguistic factors that should be considered. So thinking about dialect differences, thinking about other linguistic features that might make a student perform differently on any of these tasks. You want to take that into consideration when you're interpreting their scores. And as I've mentioned, glean a lot of information out of the prompting and teaching that you did during the assessment. So how did the student respond to that? What level of prompting was necessary to get a correct response? Did you actually tell them the right answer and they still had trouble even repeating it to you, right? That's very helpful information for formulating a plan and telling you how much support a student is going to need to learn that skill. So just to sort of circle back to the problem-solving process, this idea of the Acadience Reading Diagnostic being an example of a diagnostic assessment you could use at the second step of the problem-solving process when you're asking why a problem is happening. So a problem that's observed in the area of reading comprehension, using a tool to dig deeper to figure out that why kind of a question. So that diagnostic assessment, that's where we've been focusing. So let's just talk through a case example, sort of start to finish here, very similar to the example of student C that I was showing you at the beginning of the presentation. We could think about a fourth grade student. We could think about a student really up through high school who could fit this kind of scenario where we might be screening on oral reading fluency, perhaps as early as the middle of first grade, right? So I'm just saying fourth grade as an illustration. So the scenario from the screening data with oral reading fluency might play out like this, that the student is doing perfectly fine on accuracy in reading that 1-minute passage. They might be perfectly fine in terms of fluency as measured by ORF words correct, but where they're having difficulty and scoring below or well below benchmark is on the ORF retell and on the Maze assessment. So again, setting the stage for that kind of a student who is accurate and fluent, and you would expect them to understand what they're reading, but they're indicating that they're having difficulty with comprehension. At step 2, at problem analysis, we want to think about variables in a broad way. So not just variables related to the student themselves, but also related to the instructional environment and the curriculum and instruction that's being used for the student. So we're thinking about sort of fleshing out with our problem analysis questions, all of these variables that might be impacting this low reading comprehension that we're seeing. And thinking about it in this way gives us multiple points of influence. It gives us multiple ways to intervene and gives us a little bit more power in this situation. So the kinds of problem analysis questions that we might ask at step 2 would be perhaps related to listening comprehension. So does the student understand text that is read to her? Does she have difficulty telling stories? If you ask about her weekend, are you observing that she has difficulty describing events that happened during the school day? What do you know about the student's language structures, vocabulary, morphology, syntax, for example? Can the student draw inferences? Can they generate inferences from what they hear, from what happens in conversations? happens in their own life, for example, and what's the student's sort of state of background knowledge. So do they have broad general knowledge and experiences? These would be some kinds of questions that we might ask with a student in this type of scenario. And then that would help narrow the focus of using a tool like Acadience Reading Diagnostic CFAL. We might choose the sections, the domains and tasks that I've listed here. So we might choose the retell task, just one within listening comprehension. We might want to explore past tense and plurals in the area of syntactic knowledge. We might explore making words within the morphology component. We might give figurative language task within vocabulary, right? So that might be how we make selections based on our problem analysis questions. And fast forward, in this scenario, you can see that as a result of giving this assessment, the student needed support in all of these areas. So she had difficulty even with prompting and teaching. She had difficulty with several of these areas. And so we're starting to get a picture of the kind of instructional support that might be helpful and necessary for this particular student. So that's what we would do next at step 3 of the problem solving process, is we would plan and implement what the instructional support should look like for this student. So without going into a lot of detail, I'm going to give you some resources for planning support, but the kinds of things that we might do could include things like directly teaching morphology, directly teaching vocabulary, making specific choices about words to teach prior to reading a selection to the student or asking her to read a selection. So there might be some direct upfront explicit instruction that we're providing in the area of morphology and vocabulary. We might also be doing some very planful support of listening comprehension, let's say before and during a read aloud that we're doing with the class. We might be identifying aspects of the text that we're going to read aloud that could cause this student to have some difficulty. That might be sentence structure that occurs in the passage that we're going to read aloud that might be kind of tricky, maybe some use of words that is unusual that we want to support the student ahead of time by directly teaching. Maybe making sure that as we're reading, we're stopping and we're checking in on the student's understanding. And then certainly after we read to the student, doing a lot of conversation to make sure that the student has understood what was being read to them. So some ways to plan and support intervene with the specific areas that were identified on the diagnostic assessment. So in the manual for Acadience Reading CFAL, there's an example of an instructional planning form. The details of this aren't important. You probably have a way that you document your intervention planning. And so that's what you would use, is a way to just capture exactly what you're going to do, who's going to do it, when it's going to happen, how it's linked to the assessment data that you've collected, and perhaps how you're going to measure the student's growth in those skill areas so that you'll know when that support can be faded, when they no longer need that instructional support or intervention. Documenting all of this in writing is really helpful in terms of collaboration across different professionals who are working with the student, in terms of documentation as the student goes to the next grade, or if they might move to another school. So in addition to that planning form that's in the assessment manual for Acadience Reading CFAL, there are a lot of excellent resources. So I tell people, this is one of those test manuals that you actually could read cover to cover. Like, it's chock full of really helpful information. So one of the appendices that I would draw your attention to is related to instructional resources. So there are 38 annotated research references that are linked to each of those 7 domains. And in each of those annotated references, there's a summary of the key points of the research study, sort of the key ideas are highlighted, and there are specific suggestions for teachers. So how to translate that research into instructional practice. There is an Appendix F that includes some free instructional resources that you can find online. Free is not always the best, but free is sometimes where you need to start, right? So being able to access something quickly without having to spend money is always good. And then Appendix G gives some ideas for scope and sequence. And when it comes to the language comprehension and reading comprehension skills, the order easier to harder, simple to complex is not as straightforward as it is in the word recognition domain, but there are some suggestions in the manual. And then a very long list of references. So all of the research support for why these are the kinds of skills, the linguistic and cognitive skills that we're measuring on a comprehension diagnostic. So I want you to just pause and think for a minute about a couple of questions. So what are your thoughts about what's being measured on this particular Acadience Reading Diagnostic CFAL assessment? So think about what's being measured. Think about how it might compare to how you're currently measuring reading comprehension. Think about the kind of support that might be required for educators to use a tool like this. What kind of training, what kind of coaching would be helpful? What kind of conversation would you want to have as you're learning a tool like this? What would educators need to understand what they're getting, the information that they're getting from a tool like this, and how to translate it into practice? So to summarize, as we started out, measuring reading comprehension is a complex activity. There is not a lot of agreement in terms of even what the construct of reading comprehension is, how it develops, what's related to it. And so measuring it is quite complex. When students have difficulty with reading comprehension, teachers need a way to tease out those underlying linguistic and cognitive processes, to sort through what's at the heart of that reading comprehension problem beyond strategies. Acadience Reading CFAL, Comprehension, Fluency, and Oral Language, is one option as a research-based assessment that is also teacher-friendly and linked to instruction. So I have a couple of slides here that include some resources that might be helpful, some of which I have mentioned, others that I haven't mentioned. So a couple of books that I would point you to if you want to go deeper. Kate Kane's book is listed here. Isabel Beck's book, the one on vocabulary, is on the next slide, but her Questioning the Author book is quite excellent. It's been recently revised. I would point you to that one as well. Nancy Hennessy's excellent Comprehension Blueprint is a fantastic resource for teaching the kinds of things that I've been talking about assessing. Syntax is an area that we sometimes don't have as much knowledge of, or have as much information about how to teach. So I'm pointing you to the Literacy How Professional Development series on syntax. And I'm really happy that the authors of that PD series, Margie Gillis and Nancy Eberhardt, are presenting as part of this literacy symposium on syntax. So that's another excellent resource for you to turn to. Choosing words to teach. So this is Isabel Beck's idea, is communicated on the Reading Rockets website in a nice, accessible way. I really like Susan Eber's blog on vocabulary. There are several good instructional resources related to teaching the kinds of things we've been talking about measuring. One of them is called Vocabulary Through Morphemes by Voyager Sopris Learning. And then there's Isabel Beck's book, Bringing Words to Life. It's really an essential tool for directly teaching vocabulary. The 6-minute solution is an approach to building fluency, an important element of reading comprehension. A couple of other fluency building resources that I'm including here: Read Naturally and Quick Reads. And then Jan Hasbrook is the absolute expert on the topic of oral reading fluency. And she has a variety of excellent resources and webinars out there in the world. I'm just linking you to one of those in case you're not familiar with her work. So check that out. So just some things to get you connected to. There are certainly others, but those would be some that could get you started if you want to dig deeper into some of the topics that I've been communicating about in the presentation.